Some bad news this week. A Texas appellate court has overturned the conviction of former House Majority Leader Tom DeLay for allegedly scheming to influence Texas state elections with corporate money. A three-judge panel voted 2-1 to overturn the conviction, calling the evidence, quote, legally insufficient, according to court papers filed Thursday. The decision formally acquits DeLay of all charges, but it could still be appealed by the government. Just hours after the ruling was announced, Tom DeLay visited Capitol Hill for a long-scheduled lunch meeting with members of the Texas Republican congressional delegation. Surprise, surprise, because back in 2010, when he was convicted, this all has to do with him bringing this corporate money into Texas to influence elections to win the Texas state legislature so that they could write better congressional districts that would defeat Democrats and elect more Republicans. The reason I know so much about this is because of our next guest. His name is Eric Burns. He's the former president of Media Matters for America. He's also a former senior advisor to Congressman Chris Bell, who filed the initial ethics complaint against Tom DeLay, which caused all kinds of controversy. And Chris Bell was a victim of the very redistricting that Tom DeLay and his cohorts pushed through with this corporate money. Eric Burns, thanks for joining me. Eric?
Yeah, I said, can you hear me?
I can hear you now. I would also be remiss if I did not mention that Eric Burns is my business partner at Bullfight Strategies. So thanks for joining us, Eric.
No, thanks for having me.
All right, so put us in your shoes, years ago at this point, when Chris Bell was deciding whether or not he would file this first ethics complaint against Tom DeLay.
Well, I'll tell you, it was a climate of fear. There were quite a few folks on the left that had been involved with going after Newt Gingrich for his ethical lapses, in the late 90s, that knew about this, that warned us that we were going to receive death threats and we were going to receive, potential acts of violence, and that this was a serious group of folks that were essentially thugs. Now, that thankfully never happened, but we had to really sit down as a group, the entire staff, and the Congressman Bell in particular, who I think has demonstrated incredible courage and do what nobody else was willing to do, and that was to stand up to somebody that everyone knew was absolutely corrupt in Washington, that was the king of K Street. He was the architect of the K Street project. Obviously we knew a little more because we were, my boss, Chris Bell, represented a district in Houston, Texas, where Tom DeLay is from, which is also where I'm from. It was an attempt to actually really change, to do something bold and to bring attention to this problem and to try to impact some change for the better in the people's house. And I think it was.
So you guys filed the complaint, and then what happens? I mean, the whole political world just kind of exploded.
Well, there hadn't been there had been an unspoken ethics truce between the Republicans and the Democrats for 7 or 8 years before Chris Bell filed the ethics complaint against Tom DeLay. It was like a 147-page complaint that outlined not just money laundering, but also abuse of power, potential bribery allegations, and it was actually not even very terribly welcomed by some members of the Democratic leadership, to be honest with you. But it absolutely shook the Capitol to its foundation. It was a national news story for better than a year, and I think it completely changed the face of the debate. This was in 2004. 2003 is when it started. The ethics complaint was filed in 2004, and it really changed the debate and really dominated the debate in Congress and ultimately in the country leading into the 2006 elections. So when the Democrats took over the House in 2006, the exit polls showed that even with the war in Iraq not going well, the culture of corruption of the Republican Congress was the number one issue that led them to vote the Republicans out of power. And I think it was a direct result of the courage that Chris Bell showed in standing up to Tom DeLay. It was a David and Goliath situation.
Well, and maybe that's what's so frustrating about reading these stories. I mean, they're all just like 300 words. Tom DeLay was acquitted, and they mentioned the money scheme in Texas, but they don't talk about him shaking people down on the House floor and telling them, we'll get you X number of dollars into your campaign account if you vote for, this Medicare Part D, and
That's right.
you'll be stripped of your committees if you don't do this and do that, and
letting cabinet members on the floor, which is against a major violation of House rules, to strong arm members of Congress. There's no discussion right now of the fact that he used Department of Homeland Security anti-terrorism resources for his own political benefit, and was ordering the resources that we had at the time to go track down Texas legislators to force through his mid-decade redistricting of the Texas legislature, which resulted in which I contend was illegal, but was the first one in history,
right.
And resulted in, I think, a six-seat net gain for Republicans. And frankly, Carl, has become the model for what Republicans are trying to do now in states across the country.